gamers, we, alongside some of the world's most talented game developers, are going to show you why gaming's best days are right ahead of us.
2026 has been a year. We've seen the price of games hardware climb into enthusiast territory, physical ownership take another huge blow thanks to this year's biggest release, the launch and immediate crash of brand new multiplayer games, and the closure, or looming closure, of studios responsible for both cult favourites and bona fide classics. It's kind of absurd to think that we're only just over 6 months in. Unfortunately, even as a channel that mostly covers independent releases, these trends still affect the little guys. They rely on the same funding, audiences, and ultimately the same consoles, phones, and PCs as every other game. Even so, there's a sense that, should the worst happen, hobbyists and smaller creators will keep finding ways to make games long after the biggest machinery is ground to a halt. The industry might look bleak, but the present for games is incredibly exciting, and even if you avoided the AAA this year, indies have been fiercely competitive. Mina the Hollowers or Yacht Club returned to glory with Bloodborne-inspired action and Game Boy Color era aesthetics. Mutagenics finally escaped development hell to deliver Edmund Macmillan's bizarre fusion of XCOM-style tactics and cat breeding, where rubbing together furry little freaks produces even stronger and stranger soldiers. Vampire Crawlers has transformed Ponsor's Particle Party Bullet Heaven into a dungeon crawler with an irresistible wildcard combo building system. Esoteric Ebb has emerged as perhaps the closest thing we've had to a true Disco Elysium successor, even considering Zaum's actual Disco Elysium successor, while surprise hit Titanium Court has found fascinating new wrinkles in embedded and emergent storytelling that outpace what the larger studios are attempting. I've even heard that Cairn is good, though I haven't tried it myself. I missed last month's Steam Next Fest, and these aren't all demos from my DMs, so this is going to be a bit of an odd recommendation video. I mostly wanted to write about what I've been playing over the past few weeks. Think of these more as little essays, using each game as a jumping off point to explore the wider tapestry of what we call video games, at a moment when that tapestry feels like it's being pulled apart. As always, you'll find links to every game mentioned in the description below, and I can confirm that each one was played on either Mac or Steam Deck. Let's start with one of my favourite demos of the past few weeks, courtesy of the developers at Biting Games, a studio that put so much care and attention into their debut title that they even went to the effort of composing their own appropriately skate rock soundtrack to avoid setting off Twitch's streaming rules. They're keen for you to play this one loud and, more importantly, play it again and again. That game is STUNTBOOST, a title that, to borrow the paraphrase words of fellow indie Naut Static Canvas, cleverly blends Tony Hawk with Trials. It's less about the art of chaining together tricks and more about surviving a downhill jam as fast as possible. You can make moves, of course, but your focus is going to be on reaching the goalpost rather than building a combo. It's a game where the thrill comes from beating your friend's best time on a shared leaderboard, not unlike 2022's Neon White. But my favourite aspect of STUNTBOOST is its world. In the developer's own words, it's a love letter to the Tech Deck, the 90s novelty toy that gave your fingers a miniature skateboard to grind, flip and trick across everyday surfaces. From that diminutive perspective, you're pushed through obstacle courses built from both handcrafted materials and found objects, constantly shifting between purpose-built structures and cleverly repurposed household items. In the game's opening moments, pegs hold up post-it notes to form a forest picket in the style of the Spy Who Loved Me ski escape, while bright orange racetrack pieces, wooden headboards and even a drum kit all become part of the adventure. It absolutely nails one of my favourite visual styles in games, the crap map. Or to expand on the Counter-Strike specific parlance, environments that let you see the world from an impossibly small point of view, reinterpreting living rooms, bedrooms, dinettes, oh yeah, as sprawling worlds to explore. Think the Toy Story games, or even the still underrated, still not reviewed by Hot Cider, Tiny Kin. It goes beyond simply shrinking you down and leaving a room untouched. Instead, it feels deliberate, as though someone has built this entire environment specifically for you to navigate. And STUNTBOOST uses that idea brilliantly in service of its time trials and high score chase. As I said, this was only my quick look at the early demo, which should still be available on Steam if you want to try it for yourself. But for a fresh spin on Tony Hawk style action, joining the likes of Devolver's Skate story, it's one I'm really keen to see more of, especially if the board eventually breaks out of the bedroom and finds even more room to transform into obstacle courses. Let's slow things down for the next one and take a trip to the seaside. Elfie, a sand plan, is an ode to sandcastles, structures that are infinitely malleable thanks to their semi-solid material. They're temporary by nature, destined to be washed away at the approaching tide before the day's end, existing afterwards only in photographs and the haze of nostalgia. And even while they stand proud, their identity is always shifting. Even before the ocean can erode them away, the azimuth of the sun casts different shadows across their spires throughout the day, subtly changing the character of the same fortress depending on the time. Truly a metaphor for how our empires grow and collapse, and how history reinterprets their efforts as heroic or villainous as our culture develops. That's what I found myself thinking about while playing this puzzle game of flattened perspectives. Given only orthographic views to work from, you have to build sandcastles that match silhouettes from multiple vantage points at once. Early on, you can get away with a few illusionary tricks, staging more elaborate castle designs than the game is really asking for, but as the puzzles become more demanding, thinking from multiple angles becomes the entire point. This is very much a classic static solution puzzle game, where the game is looking for one or two specific answers and the challenge is simply finding your own path to them. There were times I found myself wishing for a little camera wiggle, or an easier way of manipulating objects buried in the foreground, but ultimately this is a game that's as flat as its viewpoints. The overlap between them is the puzzle you're solving. It's a limitation of the art style that's been embraced completely, informing the entire challenge. It all sounds awfully technical, and maybe I'm making a sand mountain out of a sand mound in lavishing so much praise on it, because this is very much one for the cozy crowd. There are no timers, no high score leaderboards, really your only motivation is intrinsic. You just want to keep solving these increasingly elaborate sandcastles. And I suppose that motivation is helped along by Elfie herself, the spherical star of a sand plan. I have to admit, part of what drew me to the game was my fascination with her character design. She belongs to a canon of creatures I affectionately call little guys, alongside all-time greats like Uncle Amiibo and the most delightfully gormless Pokemon starters. The characters that sit on that line of abstract simplicity which somehow creates more personality, a sort of reverse uncanny valley. Elfie, with her comically beach ball proportions and charmingly crude rendering, ends up becoming a more memorable master of ceremonies than Unreal Engine 5 could ever dream up. And then you actually play the game and it all clicks into place. She's a squeaky little supporter, always checking whether you're having a good time, whether you need a hint, whether you'd rather skip ahead to the good stuff. She's like a stuffed animal brought to life, driven entirely by the desire to keep you happy. Sandcastles might be temporary and summers always come to an end, but Elfie wants you to know that you'll always be welcome back for another visit. At a time when it feels like cruelty has almost snuffed out empathy, even a little beach ball shaped elephant who just wants to help you build sandcastles feels like exactly what's needed. I went into this next game expecting a throwaway Vampire Survivors clone set on the ocean, and on a high level that's kind of what Nautical Survival is. If you've already spent a few hundred hours grinding thousands of mobs with automatic projectiles, then this will probably feel like the same old dance on first blush, but somehow I ended up sinking more time into it than I had planned. Maybe that speaks more to the strength of the genre it's riffing on, but I do think Iden Ruse, the developer behind NS, has done more here than just follow in Poncel's footsteps. Instead, they've hitched anchor and set off speeding towards something more ambitious than a straight clone in a sailor suit. Nautical Survival does exactly what its title alludes to. You're piloting a small boat across an almost infinite sprawl of ocean. You start with only a small circle of lit safe zone to navigate and farm baddies within, but you can spend the same drop rewards used to upgrade your ship, weapons and crewmates to also upgrade a central lighthouse, expanding the safe zone and unlocking new opportunities on the board. This is one of the most interesting evolutions of the Vampire Survival style formula I've seen so far, an arena that isn't just a backdrop for turning enemies into chum, but a kind of ecosystem with its own economy. There's a hospital that emits a zone of healing, a factory that generates tokens you'd otherwise get from killing mooks, a warehouse that increases your ship's storage for upgrades, and most interestingly, a post office. It unlocks a passive minigame where you can pick up letters and deliver them to various islands, earning extra cash and even new perks for your trouble. Then there's a roaming trader ship that sails through the area, letting you buy, sell and upgrade weapons at any time. Instead of that locked down Vampire Survivors mindset, things are a little more natural here. Nautical, one might say. There's no longer a need to wait for a new run or a break between waves to rethink the build. Instead, decisions happen organically in the moment. While surprise races between floating buoys and boss battles often interrupt the rhythm of wave combat, once you unlock these extra buildings, you can almost avoid combat altogether in pursuit of passive income. To give the game perhaps the most absurd praise it will ever receive, it pushes the genre away from pure arcade survival and closer to something like Rockstar's Red Dead Redemption. Not just arenas of constant action, but a living ecosystem you can navigate and exploit if you're willing to engage with its rules. Nautical Survival still has all the roguelike upgrades you'd expect, but I really like the wrinkle that your choice of ship and then your choice of crewmates adds genuine personality to a build. It nudges things further into the space of roleplay that Rogue originally inspired, where you're assigning identity to your decisions rather than simply optimizing for efficiency. You roll with what you're given, and build your own small emergent narrative from it. Of course, each run only lasts a few minutes, but it's quick to jump back in and try again. Visually and sonically, Nautical Survival has real personality, reminding me most of all of Lambia's classic ridiculous fishing. Beyond the aquatic themes, it's the angular, flat-rendered characters, complete with gloriously exaggerated mustache, that really stand out, feeling like a playful nod to the hipster aesthetic of the early 2010s. The whole thing is rendered in a striking black and blue palette, punctuated with sharp yellow highlights, so the action always pops exactly when it needs to. If I didn't know any better, I'd think this was made by developers forged in the fires of early TIG source-era experimentation, taking a more esoteric approach to sprite work and sound, looking to upend the T-table on the day's popular genres, and trying to expand mobile-friendly concepts into something closer to AAA scope through layered systems that give the illusion of a larger world unfolding around you. So yeah, if you thought you were burnt out on the Survivors genre, this one might just win you back. Maybe it's not technically the most ambitious, but there's enough depth to Nautical Survival's waters that it's worth taking a dip. As Nautical Survival highlights, we're not really out of the indie obsession with the vampire survival formula yet. Whether you call them bullet heavens, horde survival, automatic shoot-em-ups, developers are still finding new ways to twist Ponsol's breakout hits into something fresh. A cynic might say it's just indies doing what AAA studios have always done, chasing the latest trends for diminishing returns. An optimist, meanwhile, might argue we're watching a genre find its footing, much like the Doom clones of the 90s eventually evolved into the first-person shooter, becoming a design language in its own right. I'm somewhere in the middle. Automatic combat and slot machine progression weren't invented by Vampire Survivors, and even its specific take on the formula had predecessors like Magic Survival. I don't think these mechanics are destined to become a foundational language on the same level as first-person shooting, but I do think they're an excellent seasoning. Used thoughtfully, they can elevate an existing recipe rather than define it outright. Last year's favourites like Ball Pit, Maze Mice and Absalom proved that point. Roguelike mechanics aren't inherently good or bad, they're just tools, and the quality of the game depends on how the rest of the design supports them. I say all this because I want to spotlight another game built on Vampire Survivor style mechanics, and one that reshapes them in genuinely interesting ways, from one of my favourite indie developers. Blood Dungeon is the latest experiment from Messhoff, the studio behind my all-time favourite fighting game, 2014's Nidhogg. A lo-fi Atari-soaked fencing game built around tense stop-start bursts that shift between careful swordplay and cannonbolt-style sprints towards the goal line. It's an all-time party classic, and honestly I'll even defend the much maligned Nidhogg 2. Beneath its initially off-putting art style is an excellent sequel that builds magnificently on the original, like Street Fighter 2 and Art of Fighting did on their originators. You might be wondering then what Messhoff has been doing for the past decade. The answer was last year's excellent Wheel World, a cycling adventure that saw the studio stretch into fully polygonal 3D. But Blood Dungeon feels like a return home. It's not only another 2D combat game, but one that embraces the same gnarly, stripped-back aesthetic that gave the original Nidhogg so much personality. The Survivor's influence is immediately obvious in Blood Dungeon. Enemies pour in wave after wave, held back only by the increasingly ridiculous arsenal of projectiles that fire automatically as you scramble for safety. The real hook, though, is that movement. It has a twitchy and improvisational energy of something like Spelunky or Hotline Miami. This is a side-scrolling dungeon crawler where every surface is climbable. You scamper up walls, swing from chains, dive underwater, and weave through swarms of monsters as you hunt for keys that unlock deeper layers layers of the dungeon. It's frantic, wonderfully physical, and like the best Survivor-style games, feels completely different depending on which character you choose. In the demo, which I should mention I played during Steam Next Fest and on the Steam Deck, you initially have just two characters to choose from: a deranged looking baby armed with twin machine guns, and a completely nude barbarian who lets his willy swing with pride as an orbit of swords does the talking. It's an eclectic cast, and while eccentric character designs aren't exactly new to the genre, Blood Dungeon elevates them through its visual identity. Where Nidhogg had an almost rotoscope quality to its low-resolution sprites, sitting in an uncanny valley between fluid animation and chunky pixel art, Blood Dungeon revels in something far cruder. It reminds me of early Adult Swim oddities like 8 Ounce Mouse or The Problem Solvers, the kind of work where you can feel a genuinely talented artist deliberately making something that looks amateur, not because they have to, but because that's the point. Even the title Blood Dungeon has the blunt stupidity of a 14-year-old's first Doom mod, and the rest of the presentation follows suit. Characters look like scrappy MS Paint doodles, animations are wobbly and buzzy, the bestiary is full of creatures that leave you wondering what the artist was even trying to draw. It's knowingly ugly in a way that's become surprisingly rare. Rather than chasing the polished AI-assisted gloss that's beginning to creep into indie games, Messhoff have built an aesthetic that's lowbrow and unmistakably human, all in service of gameplay that's dense enough to carry it. I think this is one to watch. Maybe it won't redefine the Survivor's formula, but it feels like one of the strongest arguments yet that these mechanics still have somewhere to go when they're treated as ingredients rather than the entire meal. Coming off the studio's biggest project yet with Wheel World, Blood Dungeon feels like a return to Messhoff's roots through the lens of 2026. Even if it never captures the indie zeitgeist the way Nidhogg did in the early 2010s, I hope it finds the audience it deserves. One that not only embraces this strange little experiment, but discovers the rest of Messhoff's catalogue while they're at it. More than anything, it leaves me excited to see whatever weird idea they decide to chase next. I realise that, especially at this time of year, and in a year where the industry can feel outright hostile to players, recommending you spend your hard-earned cash on things I've enjoyed but can't guarantee you'll adore is quite an ask. So instead, I'd like to point you towards two full games that are completely free to play. Not cut-down demos, but fully formed, complete experiences you don't have to spend a penny on. Well, to be honest, one is a Pico 8 game and the other's a Wordle-like, but what a Pico 8 game it is! Carrot Kingdom is the latest experiment from one of my favourite up-and-coming developers, responsible for my Hot Cider Game of the Year 2025, Motion Wreck. Ironically, that game also began life as a Pico 8 prototype, a vertical slice designed to push the concept as far as it could go before better graphics, sound and gamepad support were even considered. Carrot Kingdom follows in the same lineage, a clever little game built around one mechanic that gradually expands as you play. I'll avoid saying too much, mostly because the game only lasts a few minutes, but as you can probably see from the footage, it's all about using a bunny's extending ears to pull on and manipulate the environment in increasingly inventive ways. The closest comparison would be something like Metroid, with its exploratory, interconnected structure, but it's not a Metroidvania in the sense of unlocking new abilities over time. Instead, the game teaches you new applications of a single mechanic through a series of small, elegant knowledge checks, slowly revealing the full breadth of what it can do. It also does one of my favourite things in games. If you go in already understanding the mechanic, you can basically solve it instantly. As mentioned, you can finish the whole thing in just a few minutes, even if you take the time to hunt down every last carrot in the kingdom. Like Motion Wreck before it, it'll be interesting to see whether this idea expands into something larger, or remains a tightly polished, bite-sized sketch. Either way, it's another showcase of how sharp this developer is. Just when you think every possible game idea has been exhausted, there is still puzzle platformers finding new tricks for old dogs. And in this case, you get to see it for yourself for free. I'm a bit of an outlier among my friends because I'm still keeping up with the daily Wordle style games, whether that's Connections, Cine2Nerdle or the whole LinkedIn collection of puzzle games, but if the idea of daily ritual games sounds a bit absurd to you, then RNGeedle might be the one that actually converts you. Here's the pitch. Once a day, you click a button and it generates a random number. That's it. You're then competing against the entire world to see who got the best number for that day. The number itself isn't the score, it's the string of absurd achievements it generates. It could be how many repeating digits your number has, whether the digits mirror each other, or even whether your number has fewer than 6 digits in total. You even get bonus points if your number contains memes. It's not a static recipe then. It's possible that as new joke numbers become ratified in the culture, the scoring of RNGeedle could change completely. Wordle already pushed the idea of how simple an experience could be and still count as a video game, and RNGdoll pushes that even further. A random number generator plugged into a global high scoreboard is basically bingo on steroids. There's no real strategy beyond whether you choose to play or not, but that mass participation loop is exactly what makes it so enticing. Maybe today you've been chosen as the luckiest player of them all, but there's only one way to find out. It's the kind of thing that only the technology of video games makes viable, connected through web services and distilled into an application that only requires a few clicks. The gameplay exists almost entirely in the abstract, who you choose to play with, what goals you decide to pursue. It makes you wonder, could this game have existed hundreds of years ago, before mass communication, electricity, before we collectively decided that the number 67 is funny? It's a wonderfully postmodern idea, and the game leans fully into it. It even includes a poetry mode, where the achievements you rack up from your generated numbers are turned into small pieces of text that you can recombine into sentences. In 2026, RNGdoll has introduced a whole new audience to William S. Burroughs' cut-up technique, kickstarting a new Dadaist movement where we try and make sense of the random numbers we generate each day through divination. By cutting up the present, we create the future. It's a genuinely interesting concept that goes well beyond the usual coloured grid screenshot people copy and paste into group chats. RNGdoll gives you a way to actually express something through what is, on paper, the least expressive mechanic imaginable: a random number generator. Is RNGdoll the game of 2026? It's hard to say, mostly because I haven't bothered to check whether it actually came out last year. But in an age where it feels like the old systems are actively working against us, a literal lottery system we can turn into cut-up pros might be exactly what we need. Maybe that's the point. Not meaning, not mastery, just participation in something random together. Although I've tried to keep this list focused entirely on independently developed games, I wanted to break my own rule for a moment to talk about one of Japan's oldest and biggest publishers. Thing is, I don't actually know if Namco's Legendary Mountains is actually worth recommending, especially at its current price, but I do think it's fascinating. Mind you, this isn't some indie-style curiosity from Namco, it's a celebration of the company's own history, illustratively dropping Pac-Man, Mappy, the ships from Xevious, and a parade of other arcade icons onto a playing field, combining them to create even bigger pieces of Namco nostalgia. Because Legendary Mountains is quite simply a Suika game. You know the drill: drop fruit into a bowl, watch matching fruit collide and merge into larger fruit, and keep the chain going for as long as possible without anything spilling over the edge. Legendary Mountains takes that familiar formula and asks, what happens if you move it into the third dimension? And also, what if the fruit was Dig Dug? A few years ago, I made a video tracing the so-called sequels to Tetris, games that used Alexei Pajitnov's original design as a jumping off point. In hindsight, it became less of a video about Tetris and more a meditation on how games evolve. Every generation inherits a handful of classic ideas, then has to negotiate between preserving them and discovering what new hardware, interfaces, and audiences make possible. Suika deserves credit for feeling like one of the closest things we've had to a modern-day Tetris. Just as the limitations of Soviet computers shaped Tetris into a game of 7 tetraminos and disappearing lines, modern hardware shaped Suika. Accurate rigid body physics make every collision feel unpredictable yet readable. The simple controls are perfectly suited to touchscreens, and its cute aesthetic reflects its origins as a projected tech demo in Japan. Like Tetris, Suika feels like a concept with plenty of room to grow. Indie developers have already taken it in all sorts of directions, even inevitably by bolting roguelike deck building mechanics onto it, as last year's excellent Dogpile from the New Zealand-based developers behind Gubbins demonstrated. That's what makes Namco Legendary Mountains interesting. It's the first game I've played that convincingly translates the formula into 3 dimensions, in the same way Super Mario 64 reimagined the platformer or Quake did for the first-person shooter. Although, to be clear, Legendary Mountains isn't remotely as groundbreaking as either title. That said, its shift in perspective revealed something about the original design that wasn't immediately obvious. Moving into 3D transforms Suika from a flat combining game into something genuinely spatial, and for the first time I actually got its fruit bowl metaphor. You're no longer just combining objects into another, you're managing a physical container, constantly negotiating between gravity, momentum, and awkward angles. Where in 2D the challenge is about keeping the fruit below a line, here that line becomes a perimeter. You have to ensure nothing escapes the bowl, hence the mountain of the title. Much like Super Mario 64 turned linear obstacle courses into spaces you wanted to explore, and put goals on tall mountains you could see from almost any part of the world, Legendary Mountains reframes the objective from simply containing chaos to actively building him upward into something legible from every angle. It's such an obvious evolution in hindsight that I'm surprised it took this long for someone to try it. That said, like many early leaps into 3D, I don't think this is necessarily an outright improvement in a way that, say, racing games clearly benefited from the transition. Suika is fundamentally a game that thrives on simplicity and accessibility, something that works best on whatever device is the least powerful but most immediately available. It's a perfect pick up and play experience for a phone in your pocket or a quick session on your desk, rather than something that demands a dedicated setup or extended attention. That said, you could imagine a version that leans harder into spectacle, something like Tetris Effect or Lumines Arise, where synesthetic presentation and audiovisual feedback transforms the act of placing pieces into a kind of meditative state. Suika could absolutely support that kind of treatment while still preserving its core loop, turning fruit blending into something more immersive without losing its clarity. As for the NAMCO of it all, I do like the voxelized reinterpretations of classic arcade sprites. The physics system doesn't actually simulate the characters directly, instead they sit inside spherical containers, which makes the collisions easier to manage, but the effect still works visually. I think I'd be just as interested in Legendary Mountains without the NAMCO branding, but perhaps that's where the publisher deserves some credit. Yeah, it's a familiar trend-driven release, but it's also one of the more ambitious reinterpretations of the formula I've seen. And if this is really the start of a wider arms race of Suika experiments, then I'm genuinely curious to see where it goes next. Competition has a way of sharpening ideas, and this feels like a space that has plenty of room to grow, though hopefully without falling out of the bowl. Let's begin this recommendation with a controversial question. What is a roguelike? Actually, let's go one step further. What even is a video game? It's a question that seems to haunt independently produced works more than anything else, because there, the line between experiences that genuinely require a computer and those that could exist as a board game, a piece of theatre, or some other physical activity is much blurrier. Nobody asks whether Grand Theft Auto has to be a video game, even though you could, in theory, go outside right now, steal a car, rob a bank, and launch yourself off a conveniently placed ramp. I should stress that I'm making a philosophical point here, not a recommendation. I found myself thinking about this while writing about RNGeddle, which is, at its heart, little more than modern day bingo. Even NAMCO, Legendary Mountains, could work as a board game, though managing the combining pieces would be an enormous pain. Have we reached a point where we've accepted that video games are simply the default home for solitary experiences? It's easier to open Steam or the App Store, spend a few pounds, and immediately start playing than it is to buy a board game, learn the rules, set everything up, and hope the payoff justifies the effort, not to mention remembering who's supposed to be keeping track of everything. And then there are roguelikes. Every indie game seems to attract the label nowadays. Throw in a little procedural generation, a handful of upgrade choices, and suddenly it's a roguelike. Is that just cynical marketing? An attempt to reassure players that this new thing resembles something they already enjoy? Or is it simply what happens when a successful design movement branches out so many times that the original label no longer has that much meaning? Maybe we're reaching the point where all these offshoots deserve names of their own. These thoughts came from two games that I actually enjoyed quite a bit. Neither is trying to reinvent the medium, but both quietly raise the same question. What exactly do we mean when we call something a roguelike, or a video game for that matter? Let's start with Fame or Folly, and a quick shout out to Gaming in the Wild, who's been doing a great job of championing this one to other creators. I likely wouldn't have heard about it otherwise, along with a few other excellent games he covers each month, so do go and check out his channel if you haven't already. Fame or Folly combines the classic push-your-luck tension of blackjack with a modern roguelike deck builder. But what really caught my attention is how much it feels like a spiritual expansion of my favourite game from UFO50, Party House. The premise is simple. You have a troupe of performers, and you send out as many as you can in a round to generate popularity and cash. Some performers bring straight value, while others also generate notoriety. Push this too far and you'll bust the bank. Just like in blackjack. Fortunately, even failed runs aren't wasted. You carry over any cash you've collected, which can be spent on new performers or perks that synergize with your growing troupe. Maybe a bonus for fielding multiple performers of a certain type, or rewarding for triggering a specific sequence of events. To progress though, you still need to pull off a successful show without going overboard. It's a strong design idea because it lets you fail safely at first. Early runs become experiments, you learn your deck, understand the odds, and gradually start making decisions about when to push your luck and when to cash out early. In a way, fame and folly could exist in the real world, but like the manning modifiers in games such as VOL.3, it would quickly become an accounting nightmare. One of the great advantages of video games is that they can handle this kind of layered scoring and conditional logic effortlessly, allowing designers to build something more ambitious than would ever be practical on a tabletop, all the while keeping the onboarding simple for players. As long as you can read your cards and understand their effects, you're ready to play. This is a demo for now, but considering how much time I've sunk in and how generous it is with cards and modifiers, Fame or Folly feels like a pretty fleshed out experience already. Not to say it won't be worth supporting once it releases at full cost, but it does go to show the strength of a generous demo in selling a concept. So a round of applause for the stupid rascals, and I wish them all the best on what adventures come next. Next in my recommendations is Demon Bluff, a solitaire take on the classic social deduction game Mafia. Instead of playing against other people, you draw a set of cards representing villages, some of whom are secretly imposters in disguise. Each has a unique ability, such as revealing how far away an evil doer might be, and the deduction comes from reading overlaps and contradictions between pieces of information. Who's telling the truth? Who's lying? And what does the shape of the information itself suggest? Each round you eventually commit to an accusation, eliminating one villager and hoping you've correctly identified an imposter. Take out a number of evildoers and you move on to the next round with more villagers and more imposters to suss out. Make too many mistakes however and the run ends, the deck is reshuffled and you start again from scratch. It's simple and elegant stuff, elevated by a lovely hand-drawn art style, clean presentation, and a particularly nice quality of life touch in the form of letting you draw annotations on the board, which helps with the deduction and tracking the suspects. The developers describe this as a roguelike, though I'm not entirely convinced, at least in its current demo form. There isn't really any deck building in the traditional sense, nor meaningful long-term construction of a strategy that carries across runs. Instead, each round is essentially a fresh randomized puzzle drawn from a fixed pool of mechanics. In that sense, it feels closer to repeatedly playing a variant of Mafia with shuffled rolls than it does to a roguelike in the modern meta-progression heavy sense. We don't typically describe games like blackjack or poker as roguelikes, even though they also revolve around repeated rounds of imperfect information and probabilistic decision making, and those games predate computer roguelikes by centuries. So I'm not entirely sure where the line sits anymore, or whether it's meaningful to draw one based purely on overlapping mechanics. The presence of prominent roguelike community figures like Northern Lion in the game's marketing doesn't really help clarify things either. It gives the impression that Demon Bluff isn't simply being presented as a smart digital adaptation of Mafia, but as something being deliberately slotted into an already overextended genre label in order to broaden its appeal. Maybe that doesn't matter to you, but it did leave a slightly sour taste for me. In an era where developers are already competing with plagiarism machines like generative AI to gain visibility, the last thing we need is further dilution of genre language to crowd out games with clearer identities. And in truth, Demon Bluff doesn't really need that kind of framing anyways. It's already very good at what it sets out to do. When we talk about the history of video games and the technologies and influences that shape them, we tend to romanticize a familiar handful of inspirations: Dungeons and Dragons, chess, and pinball. But especially when it comes to portable and home gaming, we often overlook the influence of toys. I suspect because they're so associated with children, while those other touchstones skew a little older and therefore perhaps a little more respectable. But when it comes to translating solitary physical interaction into scripted and emergent events, and these systems quietly driving them behind the scenes, mechanical and electronic toys were exploring those ideas years before we pointed an electron beam at a screen and recreated them in software. In particular, I often find myself thinking about the Japanese toy manufacturer Tomy, and how much of its work throughout the 70s and 80s overlaps with Nintendo's, almost as though the two companies were in conversation with one another. The Game & Watch, for example, feels like an LCD calculator reinterpretation of Tomy's miniature ball-bearing mazes. In 1982, they released Kong Man. On paper, it's a direct riff on Nintendo's then arcade hit Donkey Kong, climb a vertical obstacle course, reach the top, and rescue the damsel in distress. But where Donkey Kong gave players direct control over Mario, Kongman instead gives you an inert marble, one where you have to give it a little mechanical push to get rolling. There is a singular jump button just like Donkey Kong, but it changes context depending on where you are on the course. Here it triggers a lift, there it nudges a platform, further up you time your way past a mechanism driven by a tiny electric motor. All the while a countdown timer looms over everything. It's remarkable, honestly, how much tension a bit of plastic, a handful of AA batteries and a marble can generate, and how much dexterity it demands. Where cutting-edge arcade microprocessors could bring a character like Mario to life, the marble's journey in Kongman is almost incidental. You could even call it a kind of reverse platformer. You're not directly controlling the character, but instead manipulating the world around it, nudging it into the right path. It's a prototype of the indirect control and real-time simulation ideas we'd like to see fully realised in games like Lemmings and SimCity. Here though, we don't really ascribe much personality to the marble. It's simply an object to guide from one end of the course to the other. This is, first and foremost, a game of dexterity, something physical toys like Kongman arguably capture even better than video games. Take for example Nintendo's Wii U launch title Nintendo Land from 2012. Donkey Kong's crash course is built around the same basic idea as Kongman, except instead of a single physical button, you're using almost every input the Wii U gamepad has to offer. The gyroscope, microphone, buttons, the lot. Rotate the sticks to spin a wheel, blow into a mic to power a fan, tap the shoulder buttons to push up platforms. It's the same simple input, unique output language of Kongman, just translated into digital hardware. The catch is that without the physical feedback of a real marble toy, everything becomes slightly harder to read. You can't feel the marble's momentum, and so you can't intuitively gauge how firmly to press. The gamepad screen does its best to sell the illusion that you're holding a little mechanical contraption in your hands, and to its credit, it mostly gets there. But there's an adjustment period that the physical toy never asks of you. Then again, there's less a failing of Crash Course and more just the nature of the translation. Video games have always asked us to internalize rules that don't exist in the real world, to learn exactly how high Mario jumps or how much runway he needs. Crash Course just asks you to do the same with weight and momentum, and once it clicks, it's surprisingly satisfying. Quick credit before we move on, the Kongman footage comes from a Japanese YouTuber who catalogues these Otomi toys, and if that sounds like your kind of rabbit hole, I genuinely recommend checking them out. Watching the technology develop release by release, you can almost trace the same arc as video games themselves. Each new toy a little more sophisticated than the last, the mechanisms a little more ambitious, and then there's something fun about the feedback loop of it. Donkey Kong inspires Kongman, Kongman pushes what a marble toy can do, and somewhere in the background the two mediums are quietly egging each other on. Tomi's real masterpiece in that space for my money is their 1970 game Athletic Land, better known in the UK and other parts of the world as Screwball Scramble. If Kongman is their Donkey Kong, lean and direct, then Screwball Scramble is their Super Mario Bros. More gimmicks, more variety, and the countdown timer pushed front and centre as the primary source of dread. And like Nintendo's best works, it even received direct sequels, with each one able to connect together and extend the action. Screwball Scramble has become a second-hand shop staple at this point, meaning most people have either played it themselves or watched someone else and immediately wanted to go. There are digital versions now too, but they run into the same problem as Crash Course. Without the ability to vary the physical weight and pressure of a press, fine control becomes a guessing game. The feedback loop that makes the toy so satisfying simply doesn't survive the translation. It once again comes back to the question of just because something can be a video game, is it always the right medium for it? Just because accessing Steam or the App Store is easier than setting up a physical toy or activity ourselves, have we traded away some of that texture that made the original experience complete? That's why I think it's so interesting when developers don't simply give up at that hurdle, but instead try to overcome it, or reframe the problem entirely. That gap between what a physical toy does naturally and what a digital game has to work hard to approximate is the most interesting design problem in this entire space. It's also, I'd argue, the one that nobody has fully solved yet. Which is where Rollick from New Zealand-based developers Crayonic Games comes in. It was one of my favourite February Steam Next Fest demos that I somehow didn't actually play until after that event had ended, and by the time I finally got around to writing about it, is now fully released. It's one of the smartest attempts I've seen at taking the design language of these old marble toys and building something digital from the ground up that understands what makes them work, rather than simply trying to simulate their surface. The game is structured as a series of small self-contained scenarios, each with their own lovingly crafted setting. Trucks navigating a muddy field, trains crisscrossing each other's paths, emergency vehicles navigating a tight cityscape. Like Tommy's Toys, each input is usually paired with another through a colour code. Rotate a track here and something shifts elsewhere too. A constraint born out of cheap toy manufacturing that informs the interesting coordination puzzle. It all comes together surprisingly well, and even with modest hardware now able to simulate the physics of a marble rolling across geometry with real fidelity, the thing just feels right in a way that earlier digital attempts couldn't quite manage. Compared to your usual platformer, Rollick & Roll is a different kind of challenge, a more cerebral one, without ever fully giving up on what makes the genre fun in the first place. And for a certain kind of player, that balance is exactly right. At a time when it feels like perhaps those in charge have so thoroughly chased after trends and quick cash to the point they've forgotten what made people love video games in the first place, it's nice to have something like Rollick & Roll that reconnects to where video games began. Not a grand leap into the unknown, but a small step from the physical into the digital realm. I'm James, and I'll see you in the next upload.